everybody doing? I'm here with Chapter 37 of Book 2 of the Royal Ranger series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. Inside the South Tower, Cassandra heard a howl of triumph from the men pursuing her, and knew that Maikaru was dead. Quickly, she turned the massive lock on the heavy door that led out to the bridge and ran for the spiral stairway in the southeast corner of the tower. The sergeant was waiting there for her, beckoning her urgently to join him. Behind her, she heard a rush of running feet on the bridge, then the hammering of weapons and fists on the door. She ran. The sergeant, sword in hand, ushered her through the narrow doorway in front of him, and together they began to wind their way upward. The stairway was narrow, barely 2.5 meters across, and it spiraled upward to the right. This was intentional, and a standard piece of design in castles of the time. A right-handed spiral meant that a right-handed attacker, climbing the stairs, had to expose his entire body to bring his weapon into play, whereas a defender, above him, only needed to show his right arm and hand. It gave a distinct advantage to the defender. Cassandra was taking the stairs 2 at a time, running light-footed, and leaving the sergeant behind. He blundered up the stairs behind her, making a considerable noise, and then began shouting, "The princess! Make way for the princess!" For a few moments, she wondered why he was wasting his breath. His heavy breathing showed that he didn't have a lot to waste, after all. Then she rounded a bend in the stairway, and was confronted by 3 of her men, standing ready, weapons bared. The sergeant had been warning them that the people mounting the stairs were friendly. Otherwise, they may well have attacked the new arrivals without warning. The men smiled at her and stepped aside to let her pass. A few steps below, she heard the sergeant's heavy tread, and she waited for him. He drew level with her, red-faced and breathing heavily. She ushered him past her. "Keep going," she ordered. Then she spoke to the 3 waiting men. "You 3 come with us." She led them up, her head spinning slightly, as she spiraled round and round. Ahead of her, the sergeant was slowing down, and she yelled at him, urging him to keep moving. From far below, echoing up the stairway, she heard a splintering crash as the door from the arched bridge finally gave way. Then more feet were pounding on the stairway below her. She estimated that they had gone up another 2 floors, and only 2 more remained before they reached the sanctuary of the upper levels. The safe haven at the top of the tower occupied the 8th and 9th floors. As they came level with the 7th floor, there was a 3-meter-long timber section set into the stone stairway. 2 more of her men stood waiting at the top of it. She and the sergeant and 3 soldiers ran past the end of it, and then Cassandra turned and gestured to the waiting men. "Pull it up," she ordered. The timber section could be removed. Ropes ran over pulleys in the roof of the stairwell and were attached to both ends. As she passed the order, her men tailed onto the ropes and heaved. The timber bridge rose smoothly in the air until it lay flush against the ceiling of the stairwell. The men tied off the ropes and secured it in its new position. Where it had been was a 3-meter gap in the stairs with a 7-story drop below it. "That should hold them up," she said, as she heard the distant sounds of running feet and shouting men on the floors below them. Distant now, but coming closer. One of the men who had been standing by to remove the timber section was armed with a bow. She recognized his uniform. He was one of the castle archers. She pointed downstairs to where the steps disappeared around the stone wall. "Anyone comes round there, shoot him," she said. "Aye, my lady," the archer nodded, stripping an arrow from the quiver at his belt and placing it on the string. He stood ready, side on, feet slightly apart, arrow nocked. As yet, he didn't bother to draw back. If anyone came round that corner, they'd be no more than 6 meters away, and he could draw, shoot, and hit his target at that distance in a matter of seconds. Cassandra continued up the staircase, reaching the door leading to the 8th floor. She pushed through it. There were 10 men in the big open space, and they turned toward the door, weapons ready, as she entered. Seeing her, they relaxed and sheathed their swords and daggers. She nodded a greeting. She looked anxiously around the small group, searching for Maddie, but there was no sign of her. Perhaps she was on the next floor, she thought, although she didn't really believe it. "Has anyone seen my daughter?" she asked, Princess Madeline. Blank looks and shaking heads met her inquiry. Nobody had seen the young princess. She looked around the group, seeking and finding Ingrid. The young maidservant shook her head as they made eye contact. Cassandra felt a moment of despair. What if Damon had captured her? He would use her as a bargaining chip to obtain Cassandra's surrender. And yet she knew her sense of duty would never allow her to surrender. And that would mean Maddie would be. "Perhaps she's hiding somewhere, my lady," ventured the sergeant, before she could finish that thought. "It's a big castle, after all." She considered his point. He was right. There were dozens of hiding places in the castle, and Maddie had been raised here. She knew the castle well. Furthermore, even though Cassandra tended to think of Madeline as her baby girl, the reality was that Maddie was a fourth-year ranger apprentice, and that meant she was a formidable warrior. She was skilled with weapons and adept at concealing herself. Better yet, she had been trained to think and plan and assess a situation. She wasn't the flighty young girl that people like Damon took her to be. But it occurred to Cassandra that there was something she could do that might warn Maddie of the situation in the castle. She beckoned Ingrid to her. "Go to the upper floor and hoist my standard on the flagpole," she said, then added, "Fly it upside down." Ingrid looked puzzled. "Upside down, my lady?" Cassandra nodded. "It's a distress symbol. If Maddie sees it, she'll know we're in the South Tower, and she'll know something's wrong." As Ingrid hurried away to do her bidding, Cassandra shrugged. It was all she could do for now to warn her daughter. She just hoped Maddie would notice the flag. Then, squaring her shoulders, she forced herself to push her worry about Maddie aside. She had to organize the defenses of the tower. She'd think about Maddie later, when things were more settled. She glanced at the sergeant. He was standing ready, waiting for orders. She indicated the small group of men watching her. "Is this all we have?" she asked. He glanced around the room, then answered, "We have 18 men in all, my lady. Some of the men from the gatehouse managed to make it to the ground floor of this tower, while Captain Damon was assaulting the keep." She nodded. 18 men. Not the largest force, but probably enough to hold the tower against Damon and his men. "How many archers?" she asked. 6, my lady," answered one of the other men in the room, an archer himself, wearing a corporal's rank badge. The sergeant, of course, wouldn't have had time to do a detailed head count yet. He'd arrived only a few minutes before her. She chewed her lip thoughtfully. In this situation, there wouldn't be a lot of use for archers. She would have preferred more men-at-arms. They'd be better suited to hand-to-hand fighting on the stairs. Still, the archers could take their turn at that as well. They were trained fighting men, after all. "Let's take a look at our supplies," she said, and the sergeant led the way to survey the stores and equipment that were maintained in the upper reaches of the South Tower. The 8th floor was a storehouse and armory. Dozens of spears and long-handled axes stood in racks along the walls, the most effective weapons for dealing with an attack from below. There were several dozen shields hanging from pegs, and an equal number of mail shirts and helmets. She counted 15 bows and 3 large wooden tubs filled with arrows. There must have been close to 500 of them in all. Farther on, she found the food supplies: dried, salted meat, barrels of vegetables and pickles, and sacks of grain piled 2 meters high. She nodded thoughtfully. There was plenty of food here to sustain the defenders. Passing the stacks of food, they came to the dormitory for the men. Rows of bunks, tables and benches for those off duty, washing facilities, and several privies, built in the side of the tower to protrude over the drop. She wrinkled her nose. Not the most savory of solutions to the men's needs, but an effective one, nevertheless. Food and weapons were well supplied, she realized, but there was a more important need: water. "Let's check the water," she said, and headed for the steps leading to the 9th floor. Here, there was another central staircase between the 8th and 9th levels. This staircase was wood, and more like a wide, steep ladder, and could be withdrawn in the event that attackers broke through to the lower floor. They climbed to the 9th level. This was the commander's floor, the administrative level. Half a dozen sleeping chambers were set along the curve of the wall. There were racks of weapons along one wall, and in the middle of the floor was a large open space that served as the command center. A table with a dozen seats dominated the space. This could be used for councils of war, or for eating and recreation, as the need arose. To one side was a kitchen area, well ventilated so that smoke from the large oven and open grill areas could escape. Cassandra had studied the layout of the South Tower and had visited it several times over the years, ensuring that supplies were constantly replenished and any items that were out of date or spoiled were removed. She gestured to a wooden ladder on the right-hand side. "Water's up there," she said, and she led the way, climbing the steep ladder and shoving aside the trapdoor at the top. The tower was surmounted by a pointed spire, covered in tiles. Inside the conical space were 2 large stone cisterns. There were steps at the side of these. She climbed one low flight of steps and eased open a lid in the wooden panel that covered the cistern. She peered in. Water lapped a few centimeters below the top. She cupped a handful and tasted it. It was fresh and sweet. The other cistern was the same, nearly full with good, clean water. The cisterns were fed by rainwater from the roof. They were drained regularly and allowed to refill to ensure the water didn't stagnate. It usually rained regularly in this part of the country, so continuity of supply wasn't a problem. She climbed down and led the way down the ladder to the 9th level once more. A soldier waited there to meet them, obviously wanting to talk to her. She raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" she asked. "The king, my lady," he replied, and she recognized him as one of the men she had detailed to bring her father to the tower. He pointed toward one of the chambers, set along the wall. "We put him in that chamber, my lady. It's got a good bed, and it's nice and airy for him. He's quite comfortable." "Thank you," she said, starting toward the door he'd indicated. "I'll have a few words with him now." Then she saw the doubtful look on the man's face, and stopped. "Is there a problem?" He shook his head. No, my lady, he's fine. Just, he's sleeping at the moment, and maybe we shouldn't wake him." She touched his arm gratefully. It was interesting to see the devotion and love that her father inspired in the men serving under him. Unlike Damon, she thought bitterly. "Thank you," she said. "Keep an eye on him, and let me know when he wakes." He knuckled his forehead in salute. "I'll do that, my lady." He stepped back and took up a position outside the chamber door. Cassandra turned back to the sergeant. "By the way," she said, "what's your name? I can hardly go on calling you sergeant, can I?" The sergeant grinned at her. "Don't matter to me, my lady, but my man christened me Merlon, so that's what I usually answer to." "Merlon it is, then," she said. She sat down in one of the heavy wooden chairs around the command table and gestured for him to sit as well. He did so, a little awkward at relaxing so close to the Princess Regent. "Well, Merlon, we're in good shape here. Plenty of food, water, and weapons. We should be able to hold out indefinitely, certainly until my husband and the Ranger Commandant get back." "Yes, my lady. When do you think that'll be?" he asked. She hesitated a second or two. It wouldn't be good for morale if the men knew she had no idea what was delaying Horace. Shouldn't be much more than a week, I'd think, she said, forcing a confident tone into her voice. She didn't want to raise any immediate expectations, and now that Merlon knew their position was secure, the prospect of a 1 week wait wouldn't be too daunting. She was saved from further discussion of Horace's whereabouts when one of the archers mounted the stairs, obviously looking for her. "Over here," she said, as he glanced curiously around the open space of the 9th floor. He turned and walked toward them. "It's Captain Damone, my lady," he said. "He's at the gap in the stairs, and he's requested a parley." All right, that is going to bring us to the end of chapter number 37. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you next time in chapter 38. God bless, and have a good one.